That would be my sort of way of looking at it.
All right, we've exhausted our speaking list.
Okay.
I'm going to ask the board, and I would hate to lose anybody to the budget thing that's going on next door. But personally, I could use a real quick break. Anybody else? Okay.
Sure.
Yes?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, 5 minutes, please. All right. We'll go ahead and get back on. Alrighty. Ed, you're back on.
Okay. So I was just going to sort of walk through these approaches and the outcomes, if that's the pleasure of the board. I was going to start talking about that. The first one, as we said, is fully funding the DB program, and sort of the variations on this approach is over what period of time that the program gets fully funded, and when the contribution rates start to increase. The first one, where it gets fully funded in 30 years, is obviously the most aggressive one, because you're having to increase contributions fairly significantly, but for a much shorter period of time. Once the program was fully funded, then those contribution rates would go away, assuming we otherwise met all of our assumptions. So in this particular example, where the contribution rates are going up by 1 percentage point each year for all the members, the employers, and for the state, in this particular approach that's shown in scenario 1A, the members' contribution, both for existing and for future members, would go up 2.6%, which is the maximum increase that we feel would have some legal basis for the existing members. The state's contribution would go up to where it was back in the late 90s, back to the 4.607, and then the employer would pay the difference, which in this case would require the contribution rate to go up another, to a total of 38.25%, or 30% more than 30 percentage points more than it is now. So that's a pretty significant, obviously a pretty substantial hit on the school districts, but it does fully fund the program in 2047, 48. And then at that point, the contribution rates, as I said, would go back down to where they are now or under existing law. In terms of the second approach, the scenario 1B, this is a more elongated full funding, where it's fully funded over 75 years. And the increases are much more gradual. They're only 0.5% per year. And it begins in 2014-15. But you can see that the increase in the required contribution is lower. The one difference in this particular case is that the state would be contributing more in scenario 1B than they would be in scenario 1A, because the idea of this is that the increases of the employer and the state would be the same. Once the state hit its where it used to be in the late 1990s, then the contribution rates of both the state and the employer would go up an additional 4%. But you'll see that they don't go up nearly as much, but they are in effect for a much longer period of time, and that's sort of the trade-off. Scenario 1C and 1D are much more similar to each other. In those two scenarios, the new members won't contribute anything more than what they're required to contribute under existing law, but the current members would contribute another 2.6%. The state would go back to the contribution rate that they were at before, and then the employer would contribute the difference. The difference between 1C and 1D, the rates of increase are the same, but in 1C, the contribution rates start to go up in 2016, whereas in 1D, they go up in 2014. So they're contributing money 2 years sooner. But you can see that the difference to the employer is that while they are contributing 2 years earlier, they end up contributing less than they would have under under 1C where they start contributing late. So you can see that the differences are, if they contribute in 2014, they only end up contributing a total of 9% more, whereas if they wait 2 years, they have to contribute a 10.5% more. So it's really just to give the legislature a sense of the implications of that approach. There's certainly nothing wrong. When the contribution rates start to increase, that's a policy decision the legislature and the governor will make, but we want to make sure that they understand that in the end, there is a cost of doing that, and this sort of illustrates that. But at least in every one of these cases, eventually the program would be fully funded, and eventually those contribution rates would go down. So that's the first outcome, and obviously that's the one that puts the program in the strongest possible financial strength. So are there any questions about any of that?
If I don't know anything about this issue, and I look at these numbers, there's so many variables moving around. I'm trying to understand what I'm supposed to make of this, because we've got funding ratio differences, targets that are different. We've got start dates that are different. We've got increases that are different. We've got increases over different numbers of years, and then we've overlaid it with different allocations by members, school districts, in the state. What I think we need to do, it seems to me that it's kind of random how these four got chosen, and how different of those variables got put together. And so, which is where I think we run into the potential problem that Rich talked about, which is focusing too much on scenarios. I know that SCR 105 said, give us 3 scenarios. I think that in some ways that request suggests that the solution is easier and more clear cut than it is, because there are so many variables. And so I'm not sure I don't know what I think we should be presenting. I haven't figured that out, but I think that what it needs to do is whatever we do needs to demonstrate there are different long-term outcomes. There are different start dates. When you start later, you have to contribute more. There are different periods of time over which you have to increase contributions. If you increase contributions more slowly, you have to keep doing it for a longer period of time. And use that as kind of the introduction, because there's so many things that change from one scenario to another. It's hard to kind of draw the conclusion about what this is telling us we should learn for the purposes of developing an actual funding strategy. If I put my hat on as theoretically being a member of the legislature.
Well, and we do precede this discussion in the report with that issue around the timing and the significance of that. But one thing that, I don't know, maybe this would make it a little bit easier in this particular outcome to try to control it a little bit is if in scenario 1C and 1D, rather than having a different contribution rate for new members versus current members, is that everybody paid the same increase, then what you could compare is 1A would be fully funding in 30 years. What you'd be able to see is a comparison of fully funding in 30 years versus 75 years and what impact that has. Fully funding with a 1% increase beginning at a certain point in time versus a 0.5% increase at a certain point in time. And fully funding with 1%, fully funding in 1% increases in 1 year versus beginning another year. So you would see the impact of these different choices by looking at all four of them, you're actually from one scenario to the next, you're only changing one variable. And maybe that might make it clearer. Okay, so what we would do then is in scenario 1C and 1D, then we would basically apply the same increase to both current and, basically to all members. And just modify it that way.
I guess, is there I guess, as opposed to doing what you just suggested, and I'm not suggesting that that's not an appropriate way to go, was there a rationale behind the choices that you made? And if so, I mean, isn't, because I have no problem with this body endorsing a set of proposals that were based on the information that you gathered during this period, as long as they're based on some rationale that we can articulate. And I guess that's my question. Is there some reason why these were chosen, and are they, is that in the report, and is there, kind of that basis for laying it out?
I wouldn't say there's any specific rationale as to why we said 2016-17 as opposed to any other future year. We're simply just trying to give an example of the impact of weighting. So it could have been 27-18 or 2018-19 or something like that. I think what we're trying, I mean, to some extent, I think we're trying to encourage people to think about it, of doing it having something start relatively soon, not waiting for another 10 years before the increases start, because then it becomes much less effective. But recognizing that it doesn't have to happen right away. So I guess to answer your question, no, there wasn't a specific rationale for that specific scenario. It was meant to be an example of an alternative approach that highlights the implications of a particular decision.
Okay, because I guess, to me, that's kind of what's missing, and yeah, kind of an explanation of, why.
Why are we showing these different approaches? Sure, we can incorporate that.
Yeah, because I agree with Paul, by moving so many variables each time, it's confusing. If you had, another alternative, maybe to, as you said, to change one variable, but then in a narrative form, say, by the way, if you delay this 5 years, it will have, in general, this sort of impact.
Okay.
And again, we're not trying to endorse any of these, we're just trying to let them have a starting conversation. So our intent here is a range of modeling, not any endorsement of anything. But we don't want them to flounder with generalizations. So it was trying to bring them back to reality a little bit.
Rich?
So, first of all, I want to make sure we understood. We've kept, if there are three parts to how we do a system, right? There's what we have to pay out, and we're assuming that is held constant in all of these, and that our rate of return is constant in all these, right? The only thing we're fiddling with is the revenue
Right.
piece. Okay, so I just want to make sure that throughout all these we've done that. One of the things that I think we ought to illustrate at some point is the uncertainty going forward, right? The truth of the matter is we don't know the rates of return. We're less certain about the benefit. I mean, we're probably more certain about the benefits because we can sort of assume that that's fixed at a moment in time. But certainly the rate of return, and the farther out you go, right? In fact, things spread. And if I were a decision maker, given the fact that we want to solve this problem over in a very long period of time, that's the right thing to do, is to do this over a very long. One of the things I would want to deal with is this uncertainty. And this gets to the point that we've heard a couple of times. Make sure we're at least moving in the right direction without the assumption that we could fix a point of something and fix it forever. Because the uncertainty, if we're out over a 75-year scenario, how big is our uncertainty curve, right? The lines look really fixed, like we know that it's going to be X. going out. We don't know that it's going to be X going out. And so I frankly think, when I think of the scenarios, one of the things I think we ought to talk about in terms of providing the 3 scenarios is greater or lesser certainty about what it is you can be doing. If you want to, the most certain thing you could do is take today, put it all in tomorrow, right? And then given the assumption we have certainty that the day after tomorrow, we're whole. After that, we don't know what's going to happen. So I know this is frustrating because we want to both show them some ideas of how we get there, but we have to do something to, at the end of the day, if I'm a policymaker, I'm going to pick something that I think is politically palatable that gets me going in the right direction.
Right.
And that, if that's, for our point of view, that would be a pretty good outcome.
Well, and any of those do that.
Right.
I mean, it's,
But we ought to show them, we ought to try to demonstrate to them that there's a little more certainty here, a little less certainty there. Shorter time frames give you a little better guess about what the certainty is up through a 20-year period than through a 50-year period. And what I worry about is what we've been talking about, which is you get stuck at this point, and it's like it becomes like this is what's going to happen if we do this forever. And
I think in his proposals that you go back every so many years back, I think you said 15 years, because we don't know what's gonna be.
well, I think we said that the legislature needs to understand they're gonna have to go back and take a look at it. The other thing is, and we didn't have it in this version of it, but, you know, in the past, we've shown the probability of running out of money, even if we do this, and the probability of having too much money. We left that out. I mean, we in every case, it was the probability of being wrong was at least 85%, you know, and we said that in the body. I don't necessarily want to identify for each one because it'll be people look at it like, oh, what's the point? You know, look at I don't want people to focus on there's a 50% chance that it's still not enough.
right, the point is to go in the right direction.
Right.
Right, and without it, so, you know, because we're going to get into this conversation, I can just see the conversation now. Have we solved the problem?
Right.
Right, which is a question without a real answer.
Right.
And it's the place where the legislature will get stuck, right? That solution doesn't solve the problem.
Right.
And we could spend a whole lot of time arguing about that when in fact we don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
I was just wondering, you know, what Pedro said earlier, I was joking that I actually agreed with Pedro for once. But I think the issue around kind of when and how much, it seems, I'm just... Yeah, I was going to say, can that reflect in the minutes? But I guess I am wondering, it seems like as we're talking, there's an issue around kind of how to make this as concise and as clear as possible. And I'm wondering if there's a way for us, I like the idea of articulating the 4 different outcomes. I think that's really clear. I wonder if there is a way, though, to kind of make the scenarios like, I don't know if we feel obligated to kind of look at all the 4 for every outcome, kind of, or if we could really say, we know that if we start sooner, if we go 1%, or, you know, if we do more sooner, that will solve the problem. If we could maybe, again, we're not recommending, we're
Right.
not, but I wonder if our scenarios that we suggest in our report could reflect maybe 1 or 2 scenarios that have that sooner, more kind of component, because it seems like that's what we've been talking about is it's kind of when and how much. And I just wonder how much we need to kind of go into all the different nuances over the 4 scenarios for each outcome, if how important that is, or if that adds actually more obfuscation to a legislature.
I guess part of the problem is that there's sort of at the very well because there are, like, using this as an example, there are 3 variables. One is, do you want to solve the problem in this particular example 30 years or 75 years? So that's one variable. The second variable is, do you want to start now, or do you want to start doing it X number of years in the future, and how fast do you want the rates to go up? So if you want to show the implications of any one of those variables, you're going to end up with 4 different scenarios. If you don't want to go into that, or we could do it like on you know, perhaps on the first outcome and not do it on the others, we can do that. I guess it's just and the other ones, I mean, the other ones have 4. Well, 2 of them have 4, and 1 of them has 3. it's just because of the number of different variables involved. There's if you want to actually show, to graphically show how the sensitivity of those different variables are, you end up having to do 4 scenarios. So it's really just a
It's like
decision.
you're covering your bases, like for them, you're
Yeah.
saying, hey, we've thought about all these
Yeah.
different ways this could
Yeah,
go
I mean,
down for this particular outcome.
Right,
So-
those are the 3 policy decisions that the legislature is going to make, I mean, assuming they want to go full funding, then how, when, over what period of time do you want to accomplish that? Over, when do you want to start and how fast do you want to get there? And so that's why you end up with 4 approaches. So we're just, again, trying to just provide the information. We can, and I think what we would do is in the body of the text, we would explain all that's really the decisions that the legislature needs to make with respect to anything. And so that's why we're showing 4 different approaches so they can see the sensitivity of, how sensitive it is to those different variables.
Would we cause them then to suffer from information overload? Because if they're asking for, several scenarios, they're not asking for 10 or 11.
We could, I guess one approach we could do is we could identify, we could discuss it entirely with respect to those 3 variables. I mean, of course, the other 4th variable is who ends up paying, how do you allocate that? So I guess it's sort of a 4th variable, but ignoring that. And just giving one example of the sensitivity of that, maybe in the full funding. That's certainly an option, I guess. The only thing I worry, well, I guess I'm thinking out loud. I guess I'm a little bit concerned about it. If we give a lot of information around full funding, even though that would clearly be the most desirable objective, that's presumably the one the legislature might be least likely to do just because of the cost involved. And if we give short shrift to the other options, they may pass over those and think, well, you can't do this, so we're not going to do anything at all. And I don't want to pass up that opportunity to have the legislature do something, even if it's not the best solution from our standpoint.
So then would it be beneficial for us just to narrow down what it is, out of the outcomes?
I mean, that's an option. I mean, again, if you don't, I guess I'd be more inclined to give them the outcomes just so that they get an appreciation of, trying to think outside of, GASB rules require 30-year full funding, and that's the only way we can do it. Clearly, there are other options available. In the end, this is going to be an entirely political decision, and so, I want to make sure they have all those options.
All right, Paul?
One way to maybe approach this so that we're not giving them a million different options, but it's kind of a logical progression from okay, here's where we ideally should be, which is full funding in 30 years. Is to start out with full funding in 30 years and say, okay, here's a way that gets you there. These are the contributions that have to be made, without saying who's making them, but the total contributions. And then saying, okay, but short of that, there's a lot of positive progress that can be made by, and then showing the impact of what if we delay the contributions for a while. Separately, what if we reduce the contributions so that they don't go up to whatever, 40% or whatever.
Right.
And then show where we get, because I think it is very important that we not overwhelm them with a million ideas, and it's also very important that we communicate the idea that we can still be making really important progress, even if we don't get to full funding in 30 years. So I don't know if that's a different way that maybe can structure the discussion.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it sounds like what your concern is that we've got sort of too many very specific ideas, and it's going to paralyze them. They'll do nothing. And we can certainly appreciate that. We definitely don't want to do that. But I don't want to truncate their options. So we'd have to sort of think about the most effective way of communicating that. But I definitely understand their concern.
Is kind of like, I'm trying to channel Ed Durman. Are you basically saying you want to be able to present to a legislator, hey, we as CalSTRS, we've thought about all the different options. And so we're demonstrating to you, legislator, we've thought about, hey, if we go 30 years. So is that kind of what, is that sort of
Yeah, I'm
why
not.
you think it's critical to
Not
have?
so much as that we've thought about it. I mean, I just want to make sure that they have on, clearly what, to the extent that people have, enough information around this stuff to be dangerous, that what they hear about is you got to be fully funded in 30 years. We need to make sure they understand, yeah, that would be ideal. That would be best. That would be the cheapest thing for them in the long run, but that's not your only option. The most important thing is, as everyone's been hearing them saying, you got to do something different than what you're doing now. You got to make it better. And we want to give them some thoughts about, some really, reasonable approaches to how to make things better. And some have, they have different implications. But, and maybe it's just an issue that we're, I guess maybe part of the problem is we've got 11 different approaches here, and we're giving them all equal shrift. And maybe that's not a good approach. Maybe we should focusing on full funding, or maybe some other things, and just sort of talk and then sort of talk about the implications of different approaches within that without necessarily overwhelming them with data. I just had to think about what's the most effective way of presenting that, but I can certainly see that if you end up with looking at 11 graphs, your eyes are gonna glaze over.
Well, I was even looking at the outcomes. It's like, I mean, as a leader, as a fiduciary of the system, I don't like even the language of avoid depletion or avoid or delay depletion. Even though I recognize what you're saying, we need to show that we're thinking in that. I think as a fiduciary, I'm thinking, either fully funded or achieve a specified funded ratio target. To me, sounds like what a good fiduciary would say. Like, our job is to make sure that the fund has money for its members. Do you know what I'm saying?
No, I understand.
So I guess that's, when I think about it, I don't know if a legislator would feel like I'm avoiding, the downside, but I would say, isn't our role to say, we want to fund this system,
And
how are we going to do it?
And we are saying that. I mean, but the difference is that you are not saying this is what we will do because you can't do any of that. We're just simply trying to provide them information about, here are some different outcomes. From our standpoint, the best thing to do.
I think it's still. Sorry. Anyway, I think you can still. I think you could still communicate though those two outcomes.
Okay.
I don't think you have to have it be about depletion of the system.
Okay.
That's just my personal.
In reality, our report is just a jumping off point for them, correct?
Yes, it is.
So we wouldn't necessarily have to overwhelm them with scenarios or information, because moving forward, we're going to continue to have discussions about whatever direction they start to get ahead.
Yes.
Still have the opportunity, not necessarily to shape what direction they're going in, but the opportunity to provide them with information, pro or con, about where they're going.
Right, but I do think it's important to make sure that I think this is the best opportunity we have to sort of lay out, maybe
Okay.
in general terms, some of the decisions they need to make, and then we can get into specifics after they say, okay, well, what would this look like? What would that look like?
Right. Harry?
I like the idea of general terms. I also like the idea of some scenarios to give them some sense of what has to happen. For me, the key is that some action needs to be taken at some time specific, some certain date, and that the longer we wait, the more expensive it becomes. And what makes me most nervous is that if the report or how it's presented, I think Jack referenced it earlier, if the communication of it, the numbers become so overwhelming and appears to be so large, and to be it's that people just say, why bother? That's what causes me the greatest pause, because from my perspective, it's really about starting to move, doing something different because it's the right thing to do for our system, for our members, and for what the DB plans provide for educators and the benefits it provides to the economy, something has to change. It has to change by a certain date, and we need to be moving the needle towards full, not empty. And the goal might be full. We might want the tank to be full. That would be ideal. But we don't have to do that today, tomorrow, next week, next year. And I think if there's if folks get the impression that we have to get to full too quickly, we can't get there. There's too many other demands and too many pressures. That would set us back, and it would be a big mistake.
Okay, so I guess now I'm trying to figure out sort of where we go from
Would you
here.
like us to?
Well, I don't think you need to go through details.
Yeah, I won't.
Other than the setup to the scheme.
Yeah, I mean, so I guess it's, I guess it would be helpful, I mean, again, looking at the second outcome where what we're trying to do is have, if we meet our assumptions, that we would not ever be in a situation where we end up in a pay-as-you-go approach. So we don't get the full funding. We may never get the full funding, but we at least hit a point where, I mean, in these particular examples, we end up being in around the mid-60s in our funding in 75 years. And based on our discussions with Milliman, they think that at that point, and it's still going up, the funding ratios are still going up gradually, that we're in a situation where we avoid the pay-as-you-go approach. Again, from our standpoint, obviously that's not ideal. It doesn't meet accounting standards, any of that. But if the prime objective is to avoid a pay-as-you-go approach and quite possibly even avoiding the way that GASB requires that financial statements be done, these are examples of how that would happen. And so I guess we need to have some better, make sure we're clear about whether or not we would show these examples or 4 different examples of that, or just simply identify that as another approach. If full funding is too much to swallow, this would be another approach, and this is sort of in general sense what it would take to get to that point.
Yeah, this might be a good one to just have a really high-level presentation of it, rather than this would be a good one to, I think, to skinny down.
Without going into these specific 4 examples of how to do
It would be more prose-oriented than graphically
Yeah, I
presented.
I think so. I think that makes sense. Clearly, if you had the fiduciary responsibility for setting contributions here, you would
never
set
do
them.
this.
That your lawyers would tell you, what are you kidding?
Yeah.
So, this probably could benefit from simplification.
Right.
Steve?
Good morning. Steve Depew, California Teachers Association staff. I have been listening very closely to your conversation, and I really appreciate your concerns. And I think there were, I'm going to try to be the teacher here for a minute and say there were some things that I really picked out that I think that are really critical, and many of you have said it in different ways. One is it's a complex situation, but you readily identified the variables in terms of when do we start paying, and how much do we pay, and who pays. And it's kind of scary at the same time, because the way I frame this is the $64 billion question. And it is kind of, well, how big is that? I would suggest to you that this will probably be the most important decision of how you approach this with this report that this board has made in years. And I think also, as you witness here today, you have a lot of information thrown at you, and you get some of that information overload. I have that coffee cup that a kindergartner gave me that says, can I go home now? My brains are full. And so this is just the beginning, because there's going to be a whole lot more that will continue on in this conversation. I'd like to compliment the staff and the actuaries. They have done a great job here trying to sort out all these variables and try to make a graphic presentation, because everybody learns differently. Some people love to hear people talk, some people love to hear themselves talk, and some people like to be able to see and say, well, what if? Somewhere the legislature is going to need something like this. Now, I think the real bottom line here is, from the work that the staff has done, who's going to define the conversation in the legislature? I think it's your responsibility, your fiduciary responsibility, to come out and say, here's what needs to be done. We can't do it. That's the way this model works. Legislature, here's some ideas for you. We, as CTA, will be over there educating those legislators. I'm sure you will be doing the same thing. But I think here's your observation point today. You can see how overwhelmed you are when you're just given this information. You have top-notch people here answering every question that you possibly could have. That is something that will be overwhelming for legislature. They won't have that personal attention as much. But I know that I can say from CTA's perspective, we're doing everything we can to educate the legislature on what this looks like. Now, this is going to seem kind of silly, but I'm going to say, cat's out of the bag. This is public information. So it's already out there. Your consideration is really the presentation of how you're going to deliver this message. I don't think you can sugarcoat any of this stuff. It's $64 billion. It's a big deal. Mm-hmm. And this is going to, we will all, everybody in this room will be at their resting place. And this will still be one of those things. Was the problem solved? I think some of the comments you made, Paul in particular, and Richard, are we on the road? Have we driven off the side? Are we in the ditch? You've got to head yourself down that road. You've got to have a goal. And obviously the full funding is the one that is, in my mind, the most responsible. So I'll finish here because I really don't want to listen to myself talk. I will just simply say, I would encourage you to grasp this. It's a big problem, and it will continue to be a big problem. Help the legislature set their discussion. And while I've been studying this stuff for years and years, I think this is probably the best presentation that I've seen in terms of how it's organized and how it goes through what the variables are. And I think, as Ed pointed out in particular, you take the full funding, and yes, here it is, we just hit it as hard as we can, and here are the variables, who pays, how much, and when. So I would really encourage you, embrace this, be bold. This is something that we would really like to, from CTA's perspective, we would like to see this solved. And as Ed also pointed out, when you look at those actuarial, probabilities of, well, no matter what you do, you might be 50, it's a 50-50 thing, throw up the coin. Embrace it, grab it, go for it. Thank you.
I didn't know whether you wanted me to hand in a formal request
No,
to
you're
speak.
fine.
Okay. My name is Rich Hansen. I'm from the community colleges. I represent the independent unions among the community college faculty. And I guess I'm sort of in a teacher role today too. I appreciate all your comments. I think you're right. You need to generalize a little bit so that folks won't just be overwhelmed by the data. That's what I find when I'm teaching my math classes. Get some general notion out there first and then maybe get into the weeds. And in that view, I was looking at some of the data that you provided, and Ed, I'd like you to just correct if I've got this wrong. But among all the different scenarios, the actual total percentage increase that's required to meet the different goals is actually a pretty tight group of numbers. And personally for me, and I'm kind of with that last comment, it's kind of a 50-50 game we're playing here about where it will actually go. So I'd be kind of inclined to do not the maximum right now, but something kind of in the middle. And I appreciate the 80% goal within 75 years, which in fact on your data today you pointed out you'd be fully funded under that plan by around 2100, which kind of makes a nice, I look for kind of round things to present to people that by the start of the next century we could be back to fully funding. That's sort of a commercial plug. But anyway, I broke down the 4 different scenarios you developed on your 4 pages. One is the fully funded option, and I looked at the 75-year option among those there. The 80% at 75 years, plus the one that would just maintain kind of where we are, And then the last one is really, the last four is really that you basically stay where we are, or you don't deplete until the year 2100. But to do that, the overall increase to be fully funded within 75 years takes about an 11.6% increase. To do it in 30 years, it's outrageous, and this is where the math starts to play its role. It takes 33.7% to do that, so that's kind of not possible. So 11.6 to do it within 75 years. Then if you just want to do the 80% model, that would take about an 18 or a 10.2% total increase. Not a hugely different figure, but lower. And then if you just want to maintain where we are, stay around 69% funded within 75 years, that would be about a 9.7% increase. Again, not a great deal different. And then just to stay solvent through 2100 is just 8.89% increase. So, you know, the problem we're facing is, if you take a kind of common approach to it, has a sort of common need associated with it, and then you can figure out where you want to be in there. And frankly, again, I'd want to go cautiously. We could go lower and still, I think it was Andrea York who said it earlier, move the needle in the right direction and really not put a big burden on your members, the state, or the districts. And frankly, there's another point I was coming to. From the union's point of view, this is all about compensation. And when you talk about the burden being split between the districts and the employees, the faculty, we're all in the same boat together. So it's really, to me, in my mind, more a matter of how much you're going to put on the districts and the employees as a whole versus the state. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Grant?
Thank you. Was it Mr. Hanson? Yes. I think your point is well taken, and as I listen to you, I think we start, rightfully so, as fiduciaries in a position of where do we ultimately want to get, and then figure out, well, how much is that going to cost if we start now, start later. But I think a lot of the decision makers that are going to, the legislature is probably going to be starting from a place of what can we afford, and then where can that get us. And so I think as we should indeed have scenarios that we think are best, but a lot of the points today were around, do we have enough narrative so that people can, you know, within those scenarios, be sort of fluid in terms of, you know, if we don't want to get exactly here, how do we get here? So that's all I want to say. Thanks.
Paul?
One other sort of separate item, and Ed and I talked about this yesterday, is all of these scenarios are just assuming that we're earning 7.5% year after year. So there's no sort of 1,000 scenarios running them through, seeing what the outcome is. As a result, in a lot of cases, the funding ratio drops before it increases. And as a result, and I know you've got the data, but we haven't seen the data.
Right.
But that you know, it drops in probably in some cases pretty low. And I think that's important information also to have, that if you're addressing the funding over 75 years, and your goal is just to get to 60 or 65% funding after 75 years, the don't deplete scenarios, how low do we get at some point so that if we then had a year when we lost 20%, that it was really bad? And I think that's another piece of information that should be incorporated, because I think that along the way, that is one of the risks of slowly addressing the problem.
So in terms of just, either in terms of this, in those cases where we show a specific scenario, or maybe just in terms of talking about specific outcome, what you're suggesting is identifying, you know, what would be the minimum funding ratio during that path, and when do we hit that, just so that there's some visibility of that?
Yeah, I mean, the other possibility is you've got these, on the left axis, you've got the percentage contributions. On the right axis, you could have funding ratio, and you could just show what the funding ratio is over time.
Yeah, it might make
Sure.
it too busy to see, but
Well,
we
if
can
you
look,
took-
I understand what you're trying
Yeah.
to say, yes.
If you took out
Yeah.
the gradations of who
Okay.
contributes, it wouldn't be.
Really? You just, like a dog with a bone.
Alrighty. So, do we want to go back to outcome 2 and talk if we want to put any of these scenarios forward?
So, yeah, I mean, it sounded like what you were suggesting is having more of a discussion of that approach as opposed to showing graphical examples of
I
that.
think that's,
Okay, that's fine.
I
We can
think
certainly
that's
do that.
probably pretty good.
And giving a sense of what would that mean in terms of what kinds of approaches would get us to that point, and not go into as much detail. Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Alrighty.
So then outcome 3 is getting at a specified funded ratio target, and in this particular example, it's 80%, and it's really just an issue of, again, how fast you get there, how quickly you get there, and when you begin doing it. I understand, as I said at the very beginning, that's certainly a common objective that's articulated as you want to get to that point. From our standpoint, it's certainly not the ideal. It's certainly better than nothing. In every one of these particular examples, we do get the full funding eventually, sometime not till the turn of the century if we are taking 75 years to get to the 80%. Again, we're not advocating any position. I just worry about the legislature thinking that's actually a good target. I mean, it's better than where we are. There's no question about that. But I hate to think that we really try to get the legislature away from thinking about the target and thinking more about the direction. And so again, whether or not, I guess the issue is whether or not this should be treated more like outcome 1 or outcome 2, where we have a discussion around it and giving some examples without going into as much detail, like what we're going to do with outcome 2, or whether or not you feel it's worth showing graphically these specific approaches. So I guess I'd leave that and open it up for the board in terms of getting some direction on that.
So my question to that is, the rest of the world talks about funding ratios.
Yeah, they do.
And if that's the dialogue that they hear outside of us, would ignoring that be detrimental to us?
I guess we wouldn't be ignoring it. I guess the question is whether we want to establish a better importance
Dialogue,
to it.
okay.
Yeah, I mean, and again, either way is fine. I mean, you're right. That is what the world talks about. That's actually the way the corporate plans are sort of structured along. That becomes important to
Right.
issues around how they operate. But this is an opportunity for us to educate the world as well. So we want to make sure that they understand that that's really not necessarily a meaningful target. It's really the direction.
Ed, wouldn't outcomes 1 and 3 be the most likely useful ones? Outcomes 1 and 3. I would have thought 2 and 4 might benefit from the greater simplification.
And that's possible. Yeah, I mean, the virtue of outcome 4, not from our standpoint, it's particularly virtuous, but it may be the path of least resistance for the legislature. I mean, so that may be the one that they actually like the most, especially if they see that we can avoid running out of money for 40 or 50 years. They might say that's a great idea. But they could just say, show us that in more detail, and we could just sort of have that discussion again. And so I think what Jack's suggesting is maybe the ones that we highlight is fully funding or hitting a target, and the ones that we have some analysis of without going into as much detail is avoiding depletion or delaying depletion.
Sharon?
I'm thinking about Grant's comment though, in terms of, I don't know, I guess I'm trying to think of this in terms of the legislature, and I don't know if that's the right way of thinking about it, but would that be helpful for them to think about a specific funding ratio? Because it seems like a lot of times they're thinking about budget, and I guess I'm just trying to understand this language. We understand this language.
Right.
We understand this language. Constituency groups understand this language.
No, I agree with that. I think scenario 4 speaks more to the financial capacity of the system, which is, right, it's a more politicized solution by far. There's no doubt about it. And I agree with Ed, that's probably the likely groundwork for a very political deal with the parties that make that deal. 1 and 3 speak more to, as you said, the fiduciary view of the funding of the system. I don't want to, we may be overthinking this too, how perfect to make this. I mean, we all know, we just got to get a great conversation going and make sure that we're not masquerading anything. I don't want something that isn't transparent enough that it looks like we didn't tell them salient issues. I think that would be really important, that there's no surprises for them later saying, oh, but we didn't tell you that if you go down that route, this can't happen, that you can't raise member contributions as one example. That would be a surprise. So we want to be upfront about where the limitations are in the strategy.
So the suggestion that's before us now is to possibly move with scenarios along outcome 1 and 3 and do pros within the report on outcomes 2 and 4. Is there anyone that wants to see scenarios for 2 or 4? Alrighty, so that helps us, Ed.
Okay, so we would graphically, we would go into enough detail on 1 and 3 to show these graphical representations is what I'm hearing, but not on 2 and 4.
But I think that there's still some concern personally, and from what I have heard from the board, is that I don't know if we necessarily want to move forward with 8 scenarios either. That maybe narrowing them down to a couple scenarios for each of one of those outcomes that shows the optimistic or most optimum funding and maybe a middle of the road.
Again, the downside of that approach is that you don't get as much information around the implications of the different variables that they have to decide about. And and it could be, I mean, quite honestly, we could have that whole discussion, because that is a decision that they have to make no matter what outcome they select, and we can perhaps just drill that down graphically using the full funding as the way to really show that. And then the same theory applies in every case. Obviously, the numbers will end up being different with it, but we can go into just the most amount of detail of that issue, showing it graphically and everything else on outcome 1, having maybe more discussion around the funding target, and then maybe having just a little bit less discussion around the other 2. But the only one that's shown perhaps graphically is just the outcome 1, just so they can see how those variables play off each other.
Pleasure of the board. Does that sound like a plan? I think that,
Okay.
Ed, I think we're good with the direction that you have outlined.
Okay.
Are there any other touch points you need for us?
I don't think so.
On this?
No, we'll go back and revise. That's fine.
Thanks.
We'll have the
Thanks.
working group digest this on Monday. And
Right.
come back with a full-blown draft report in your normal board materials, and then critique it one more time.
Yep.
Can I just ask a question?
Sure,
Maybe
Paul.
I'm not sure. So are we showing the allocation of the contributions among the various parties in these scenarios, or are we showing, is the discussion separate? First, the discussion of what is needed, then a separate discussion of, and here are the ways you can get there.
Well, I think,
I just
the
don't-
only
I
one
don't
we're
know
actually
what
showing,
the-
the only thing,
I don't know
as
what
I understand where the board's direction, the only thing we're showing anymore is just outcome 1. I mean, nothing else has a graphical component to it. And those other cases, we would clearly talk in more aggregate terms.
What Paul's asking, do we break it out as a part 2 of the discussion, how we frame the original question? First talk about the general financial needs of the system, and then as part 2, show you detailed modeling, right? Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, in other words, this outcome 1 still has this stacked
Right.
chart, which shows.
But your concern was more how we frame that dialogue, not the conclusion either, but do we embrace both approaches, separating the questions, as you said?
Right, separating the questions. I think we've had some back and forth, and I'm not quite sure where the board is, but I think we need to make a decision so that we can give that direction to.
It seems like you can accommodate all that perspective just by the right structuring of the argument, I thought.
I mean, we would have a discussion about all the parameters around deciding, all the considerations the legislature needs to make about deciding who pays what. The legal issues around the constraints on the existing members, the Prop 98 issues, which there's not a lot that we can say about that, but just laying all that out. And then as a separate matter, we could just show as an example in this particular, of this outcome only, because this is the one we're showing graphically, here is an example of of what that might look like. And all the other ones, we would only talk about it in aggregate terms anyway, because we're not going into that much detail. Is that?
Can I ask for a slight revision
Sure,
to that?
yeah.
Maybe for scenario one, we show it this way, and we also show scenario one with no allocation of the responsibilities, but with, on the right-hand graph side, the funding ratio. I mean, look, I think it's really,
Okay.
and I think you've heard from several
Yeah.
board members that we don't want, that there's a concern about complicating the issue by talking about the funding needs and the contribution responsibilities at the same time. And so I think, then I think there's also people who are saying, but we need to provide a pathway there.
Mhm.
So maybe what we do for this is we do both. We show the aggregate without the responsibilities. So we first show it so that we're showing the financial need and we're showing the funding implication
Mhm.
without talking about the responsibility. And then turn the page, next page, we show this. And here's one example of how you would allocate the responsibility to get there.
You could do that. Or, I mean, and quite honestly, we could perhaps do that with only one of the scenarios of the four. I mean, it's just, we're just giving examples.
Right.
So maybe that might, if the board would like that approach, we can just say that we will, for these four approaches on that one outcome, we won't show the gradation. We'll just show the total number. We'll show the funding ratio. We'll figure out, we'll figure out a nice way of showing that. But in this one particular example, let's say full funding in 30 years, or take one of them, whatever it is, we'll go into that whole discussion about, and this is an example of a way to allocate that amongst the different parties. So
I
we
think
can do
we're
either
good
way,
with-
whichever
I think
the
that-
board prefers.
And I think this is not our final shot at that.
No.
So if you could work that up for us, Ed, for
Sure.
our February meeting, when
Mhm.
we take a look at this
Yeah.
again, we'll know if that's how we like it or not.
Yeah, and if you don't like it that way, we can, the meeting is early enough in February, we can easily amplify and stuff and still meet their requested deadline.
Super.
Good, and there will be, again, I want to emphasize, there will be language in the report to the extent there are any legal restraints. I want to go back to the legal issue.
Right.
I mean, Brian and Ian will obviously be very involved in the drafting of the report, but just like the governor was attempted in AB 340 to avoid litigation on benefit changes, I think it's our job to point out where there's litigation pitfalls by delving into areas that we've already reached conclusions. So there will be a legal part of that.
Alrighty. Is there any further discussion on this issue then? Rich?
I have a question. Ed, how complex is the model?
It's a spreadsheet with many tabs. What do you want to run some or what? I mean, what?
Well, it occurred to me that, I have to use the word, but that it may be good to give them a little app and let them slide the.
Well, it doesn't work quite that way, but
Oh.
I
just wonder if you could make it.
Here's what.
Yeah, well, if you could make it simple enough so that, that the notion is that if they wanted to, here's what you get if you do this. Here's what happens.
Yeah, it isn't that hard for us to make. We can run a scenario other than try and get into probability issues. I can run a scenario in about 10 seconds.
Right. I just wonder if it's, we should give them a report with a little thumb drive on it and said, here, have at it. Part of it is.
I actually would have greater comfort.
would you?
Greater comfort if
it's-
they didn't have it
Yeah.
to play with,
All right.
but we would
Yeah.
be willing to go to them and play
Yes.
with it with them. You know what I mean, Rich?
Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah. Alrighty. Thanks. We did pretty well, guys. We did that in just over the 2 hours that was allotted to us. Let's take another 5-minute break and we'll come back and finish the rest of the agenda. Already, John Anderson from CTA has asked if he could make some comments also, so I'm going to turn it over to John.
Okay, thanks, Dana. Yeah, John Anderson, representing CTA, but a teacher in a town nearby in Tracy, California. First of all, I do want to, as a teacher, kind of follow what Steve said and applaud and thank the actuaries for great, scenario presentations. As a teacher, graphic representations are a good way to, it's a good teaching tool, a good way to present information. And I think the legislators will be better off for them. So we want to thank Rick Reed and their department for their work.
When they hired me, they told me it was a thankless job.
And so, but the main point I actually want to make this morning to add to the conversation is that give a little more rationale or explanation to why some of the scenarios that include waiting a few more years for the employee contributions to increase, like the 2016, 2017 scenario years, are important to us teachers, because we don't, it'll be much more acceptable to be able to, take money out of our paycheck if we have some good warnings and some good advance time for our financial planning to come into play. We haven't had raises for about 5 years now. Some districts have certainly have pay cuts. And at the same time, we've all been dealing with increasing health insurance premiums, very dramatic increases in health insurance premiums. So we've been losing ground financially as teachers. And so again, if this were to come about, that the state legislators want to increase our contributions starting in 2014, that's like shock treatment, kind of. I mean, so, again, part of the rationale that we developed through our work at CTA was that to have some scenarios that include, waiting a few more years before we have to increase our contributions, and it could be much more, better handled for our finances. And that's, I won't overstate it, but I think you all realize, and even state legislators realize, that a cut to your paycheck, or not a cut, but, a further deduction from your paycheck is tough on anybody, and especially us teachers. So thank you for hearing me out on that.